Grendel by John Gardner. I have a rather strange history with this book. I picked this book up way back when I was in middle school. The library at my school had a copy of this, and I tried to read it. Tried, did not succeed. Why in the world a middle school library would have a copy of this book in it, I have no idea. That's not because there's anything particularly bad about this book or anything you wouldn't want children to see. Rather, it's just so beyond what children are going to be able to comprehend when reading it. Uh, I just barely now consider myself smart enough or enlightened enough to pick up what this book is laying down. Um, this book is a heady, incredibly cerebral book. I saw it about a month or so ago in my local bookstore, and on a whim, I picked it up because I remembered this book. I said, that is the book that I tried to read way back years ago in middle school, and I couldn't do it. It weirded me out. It made me feel kind of weird and uncomfortable when I read it, and it kind of depressed me because this is a very bleak and kind of depressing book. It's not something that I think they should. I don't. It's not that I don't want children to try to read, high-minded books, but this is high-minded to the nth degree. Okay, I just now read this book as an adult now, and I still think that there is so much that I didn't understand about it. This is a very strange, arguably postmodern, and very kind of bleak and depressing book, but it is not without its sardonic um, black humor as well. But yeah, so that's my history with this book. But now having read it, I'm impressed to say the least. I am very impressed. But I suppose I suppose I should begin with a synopsis of what Grendel actually is. Grendel is a retelling of the Beowulf poem from the perspective of Grendel, the monster. Grendel is probably the most famous monster the in the history of English literature. It is um, kind of the protean monster uh, that so many other beasties and baddies have sprung throughout literature. Grendel is the OG monster in literature. Grendel is the creature who is descended from Cain in the original Beowulf poem, which Beowulf, who is the ultimate badass, defeats by ripping off its arm. Uh, this book, which John Gardner wrote, is a retelling of the Beowulf story from Grendel's point of view. But that is the least, really, of what this book is actually about. What this book is predominantly is an I mean intensely philosophical exploration of life and the way that we define ourselves in life and the way that we define ourselves in relation to the world around us. I was not ready to read this when I was in eighth grade. I recognized that then because I quit reading it because it was so beyond what I could grasp at that time, and it's just barely within my grasp now. But I did read it, and I am very impressed by what I read. I think this may, when I make my best and worst books list, which I plan on doing of 2021, this one's probably going to be on there because this book was incredible. If you like heady, cerebral kind of fiction. Uh, if you're not down with what this book is trying to do, please do not pick this book up because it pulls no punches. That's not to say that it's violent or off-putting, but it asks a lot of the reader. You have to be willing to contemplate and really analyze a crap ton of incredibly highbrow philosophical concepts because John Gardner was much smarter than me, and this book is quite inscrutable at times. Okay, I will say that this book is very inscrutable. But let's talk about just the let's talk about the fundamentals of the book first. Grendel is a first person book. It's told in the first person, and Grendel is a pretty likable narrator. He is the monster, of course, and the book is largely um, the account of an outcast trying to learn what they are and how to denote themselves and how to define themselves in relation to the physical world in which they dwell and the society upon the fringes of which they exist. Uh, it's easy to kind of overlook the fact that Grendel literally is a man-eating monster because he really is kind of likable in this book. He's kind of oddly innocent. Like he's kind of this weird mixture of innocence and brutality because he does tear people limb from limb and eat them, including children in this book. He eats a lot of Hrothgar's warriors, and he eats a lot of Hrothgar's uh, citizens, but he is oddly innocent. He is very inquisitive, and he's trying to learn about the world around him, learn about the universe and his place in it, and he's trying to learn where he fits into the scheme of things. This book is concerned primarily with the way that we interpret life and the way that we interpret ourselves in relation to it. There is a part in the book where discusses um, Grendel meets a dragon, which I do believe is the same dragon which Beowulf later kills later in his career, because in the Beowulf poem, Beowulf kills three monsters. He kills Grendel, he kills Grendel's mother, and then he kills the dragon. I think the dragon with whom Beowulf converses in this book is actually the same dragon that Beowulf later kills. It's actually alluded to in this book. By the way, this book is incredibly meta. It is incredibly anachronistic. It's incredibly tongue in cheek despite its heavy subject matter. It is very sardonic and kind of uh, tongue in cheek once again. It is very anachronistic. There's lots of language, there's lots of words, and there's lots of figures of speech which are taken from modern day life and crammed into this ancient poem. Uh, but there is a part where Beowulf converses with this dragon, and the dragon in this book is presented as kind of an omniscient creature. He can see the past, the present, and the future simultaneously. He's because dragons are, historically they kind of are lots of mystical abilities are attributed to them. But in this book, the dragon is an omniscient entity which can see all of existence at once. And he tells Grendel this about himself, about Grendel, that is. The dragon tipped up his great tusked head, stretched his neck, sighed fire. Ah, Grendel, he said. He seemed that instant almost to rise to pity. You improve them, my boy. Can't you see that yourself? You stimulate them. You make them think and scheme. You drive them to poetry, science, religion, all that makes them what they are for as long as they last. You are, so to speak, the brute existent by which they learn to define themselves. The exile, captivity, death they shrink from, the blunt facts of their mortality, their abandonment, that's what you make them recognize, embrace. You are mankind, or man's condition, inseparable as the mountain climber and the mountain. This is what the dragon tells Grendel his place is in relation to the humans which he preys upon. It's like that quote. I don't really want to attribute too much cerebralism and too much um, philosophical, depth to the movie Talladega Nights. But there is a quote that oh, that Sacha Baron Cohen's character makes in the movie Talladega Nights, where he says, good needs evil, God needs the devil, that kind of thing. That's the same gist, as strange as that analogy may be. This the same gist here. The dragon is telling Grendel that humans need monsters like him in order to define themselves as humans. And once again, I want to reiterate that this poem is incredibly meta. I believe this would qualify as a postmodern novel in the way that it toys with the concept of intertextuality, because this is not just a spin-off of the original Beowulf poem. It is a reinterpretation and a recontextualization of that poem. It doesn't just tell the other side of the story, it deconstructs the entire story as a whole. And so that's the in that scene where the dragon tells Grendel that his place in the world is to be a monster for the humans to learn how to define themselves as humans. It is a commentary upon the original poem and the role of monsters, because he even says you inspire them to poetry, which is what the original Beowulf was. It was a poem about a man who fights a monster named Grendel. And so it's kind of just John Gardner winking at you, where the way that he is cleverly commenting upon and once again deconstructing the original Beowulf epic in the context of his new novel. Once again, I do believe this really is a prime example of a postmodern work. It's very playful, even though it is very dark. This is a dark story. I want to say that once again. This depressed me when I was 8. I mean, not 8, when I was in the 8th grade, and I tried to read this then, and it bummed me out just as much now reading it, because this is a very bleak book with a kind of open to interpretation view on life. And I believe that the ultimate interpretation is that existence really is futile. But this book is very well written. I was very blown away with the writing in this. It is a very artfully written book, and John Gardner was a very good writer. Um, the 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 way, once again, the way that it alters the original poem. And I'm going to have to spoil this, but I don't really think that's much of a crime, considering that if you are in any way familiar with the story of Beowulf, there is only one way this story ever could have ended, and that is with Grendel dying at the hands of Beowulf. But it packs an emotional punch, and it also packs a decidedly cerebral punch. Like, I want to give this book a lot of credit, because it manages to do something that very few books can be said to do. It manages to make you think and feel at the same time. There are books there are books where their primary aim is to make you think about something, to introduce a concept to you, and then there are books that are where their prime goal is to elicit an emotional response in the reader. um, but Grendel here is a very, very, very great book in that it makes you do both. And the culmination of this book, the climax of the story, which is the confrontation between Grendel and Beowulf, is recontextualized in John Gardner's novel, not as a battle of physicality, not as a conflict of bodies, but as a conflict. Well, it is a conflict of bodies. I don't want to say that, because Grendel does get his arm ripped off and he dies. That's another thing. This is one of the few books I've read that is written in first person, where the narrator actually dies. That's usually not something you see in a book written in the first person. Because usually, if a book is told in the first person, it's pretty much assured that the main character or the narrator will survive. Not the case in this. Grendel dies just like he does in the original poem. But as I was saying, the 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 confrontation between Grendel and Beowulf in the climax of this book is a battle of bodies, but it is also a battle of ideas. And that is the way in which John Gardner uh, toys with the concepts of the original Beowulf poem is that Grendel and Beowulf are meant to represent contrasting ideas. And that is the ultimate philosophical heart of this book, is a war of ideas and a war of ways of looking at the world and yourself within it, and the killing of one outlook on life and the supplanting by that of another way of life. Now, I'm not going to say, when I'm about to read these certain passages in the book, I'm not at all going to say that I have any clue exactly what the concrete, the true interpretation of this is, but it is very clear that the fight in the end between Grendel and Beowulf has been reconfigured in John Gardner's novel here is primarily a battle of ideas. And Grendel is who we have thought of as the protagonist. He is the protagonist, but we have also kind of thought of him as a hero, as the hero of the work, or at the very least, a tragic anti-hero. It is implied that that may not be the case, because the way that the worldview that Beowulf um, tries to the worldview that Beowulf tries to force upon Grendel during their battle, because it's kind of weird. They're like punching each other and they're hitting each other, but yet they're like having an in-depth philosophical discussion. Kind of kooky a little bit, but the worldview that Beowulf tries to impress upon him is different from the worldview that Grendel has held up until now. This book is very concerned with concepts of nihilism and a little bit with the concept of solipsism. Nihilism, of course, by now we live in something of a nihilistic age, I guess, where that doesn't need much explanation. Nihilism is the belief that nothing ultimately matters, because, time goes on regardless of whatever happens. Everything that humans construct, everything that humans do will eventually be erased, blah blah blah. It's some good old Nine Inch Nails kind of stuff. um, like, we're just dust in the wind, man. We're just, nothing matters, life is meaningless, blah blah blah. This book is very concerned with nihilism, but it is rather valiant in its, or Grendel as a character, I should say, is rather valiant in his attempts to reach other conclusions about life other than nihilistic ones. But at the end of the book, toys a little bit with the concepts of solipsism. Well, the book itself toys with the concept of solipsism as well, because Grendel at one point says early on in the book, and I'm sorry I didn't pull this part out, I'm just going off memory here. Grendel says, I realize that I alone exist. Everything that is outside of me is not me. That the world is comprised only of me and not me. That is the way that he looks at the world. Uh, that it's me, and then just everything else is not me, and that's the way to look at it. Which I guess is true technically, but you get lost in Grendel's mind so much that you identify with his viewpoint in this book more than I think you're actually supposed to. And that is a testament to John Gardner's genius, both as a writer as well as a constructor of this story. That he tells it in first person, and while I will elaborate that I'm not entirely sure about the way that this book is told, that is in first person, it does create a great effect of getting you lost within Grendel's mind, to the point where you kind of don't question the conclusions that he reaches and the views that he comes to hold. That you're like, oh yeah, you're totally right, Grendel. But I think by the end of this book, you're meant to see that um, you're meant to see that perhaps he's not quite as correct as you might have believed. And it is evinced by these passages, and this comes from the final few pages of the book. Again, I'm sorry if I'm spoiling anything, but if you don't know how Beowulf, if you don't know how that story goes, I mean, it's only a few thousand years old. I can't, I can't, or about 1,000 years old at least. I can't help you there. But so these passages which I'm about to read come from the end of the book where Grendel and Beowulf are duking it out, both physically and ideologically. So without further ado, this is Beowulf speaking here. Beowulf is never identified by name in this poem, but if you are, if you know how that story goes, you know who he is. But anyway, so Beowulf says, "As you see it, it is, while the seeing lasts. Dark nightmare history, time is coffin. But where the water was rigid, there will be fish, and men will survive on their flesh till spring. It's coming, my brother, believe it or not. Though you murder the world, turn plains to stone, transmogrify life into I and it, strong searching roots will crack your cave and rain will cleanse it. The world will burn green, sperm build again, my promise. Time is the mind, the hand that makes, fingers on harp strings, hero swords, the axe, the eyes of queens. By that I kill you. And then he says in this later passage, a couple pages over, Grendel, Grendel, you make the world by whispers, second by second. Are you blind to that? Whether you make it a grave or a garden of roses is not the point. Feel the wall. Is it not hard? He smashes me against it, breaks open my forehead. Hard, yes. Observe the hardness. Write it down in careful runes. Now sing of walls. Sing. These two passages, I think, illustrate the differences in view between Grendel and Beowulf, and they represent, I believe, an evolution in human outlook, or as presented by John Gardner, at least. Grendel throughout the novel views life. He views the universe, the he views the universe, the physical world which he inhabits, is very mechanistic and governed by chaos and chance. Which is why, even though I did not pull it out, after Beowulf rips off his arm and it becomes clear that he's about to die, he can only think to scream it was an accident because he slips whenever they're, brawling. He slips and he screams that it was an accident, that Beowulf did not actually beat him, that he was only defeated by blind chance. That is very reflective of Grendel's outlook on the world throughout this. Is just this random potpourri of uh, you know just random accident, chaos, and happenstance. That's the way Grendel views the world. He does not seem to view that the world is all that responsive to will or action. But I think, and again, I'm not at all trying to say that this interpretation is necessarily valid, because this book is so incredibly inscrutable that I'm struggling as I speak here to actually formulate some kind of coherent statement about it. But um, Beowulf is kind of asserting that it's kind of a Nietzschean thing, I think. I get the impression that Beowulf is meant to represent this Nietzschean ideal of like the Ubermensch, because he very much was in the original epic, that he can change the world with his will alone, because he says, you make the world by whispers, second by second, and um, whether you make it a garden of roses or whatever is beside the point. Whether you make it a grave or a garden of roses is not the point. That he is affecting change on the world, and he is altering the flow of time and the flow of history by his willpower alone, by defeating Grendel, who Grendel is. When Grendel is defeated, all he can think to say is that it was an accident and you're not the hero you think you are. Because another big theme of this book is the concept of heroism, and does heroism even exist other than just in the mind of the would-be hero? Because you got to remember, this is a deconstruction of the Beowulf epic. In the original poem, Grendel is a mindless monster who just kills people with on instinct, and Beowulf is an upstanding flawless, perfect example, shining, perfect example of a human being. But this deconstructs that because it shows that Grendel is remarkably intelligent and remarkably inquisitive, and remarkably philosophical as well. And so it calls into question whether Beowulf actually even is a hero, although it throws it into such a shade of gray at the end, because I think you are meant to see that Grendel's outlook on the world actually is wrong, and that Beowulf's view is actually superior. And it's kind of like, it's allegorical, I suppose. Grendel is being killed, not only by the fact that Beowulf rips his arm off and he bleeds to death. It He is being killed because that way of thinking is no longer valid. And because Grendel throughout the book is very derogatory, he's very derisive towards the humans which he observes as they go about their religious practices and their singing of poetry and their writing of psalms and such. He's very derisive of all that because he doesn't view faith and belief in anything as a valid or uh, as a valid way to live life. But Beowulf seems to negate that by saying, "Oh yes, it is. We can change things, and the way that the nihilistic way that you're looking at the world is no longer valid in the terms of human history." Or maybe I don't know. This is, again, I want to reiterate that this book is the most inscrutable thing I've ever read. I think one of them at least. I When I picked it up in eighth grade, I thought I was reading another language almost. It was so strange. It was so weird and so depressing, and it is depressing. And it is still depressing now that I read it now as an adult. But I couldn't read it when I was in eighth grade because it was so over my head. I can just barely read it now and make out anything of what John Gardner was saying. It is a book it is one of the books which I wholeheartedly believe. I wholeheartedly believe that there is an interpretation to this book, that this book does have concrete meaning. It's just that my little pea brain is just having such a difficult time parceling it out. But it does not change the fact that this is probably one of the best books that I've read this year. In terms of complaints with this book, um, my biggest complaint is that even though this book works pretty well told in first person, there is kind of a question that I had. This book is not. I have said it previously that I think perhaps you should only write in first person if you are writing a novel or a story such as an epistolary novel, or writing something like a memoir or something. When you write a book in first person where it's just meant to be taken like it's all happening within the main character's head, that can lead to some pitfalls which be you know you might trip in. And I think this happened in this because Grendel repeatedly addresses the reader, like he breaks the fourth wall in this book, where he'll say, even though I am a monster, I am a creature just like you. I think and I react just like you, blah, 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 just like you, blah, blah, blah. And I couldn't help thinking, who are you talking to? Like, again, you have to, just within the context of this story, it is written in the first person. It's not a diary. It's not like a journal or anything. It's not a memoir. It's literally just second to second taking place inside his head. But it does not change the fact that when you stop to think about what that entails, when he is addressing the reader and he is acknowledging the presence of the reader, even though this entire narrative takes place ostensibly within his own mind, you're kind of just like, who are you even talking to? Like, I don't understand it's kind of it's a flaw in the structure of this book. I think, at least. But again, it's a minor thing that's overlookable, as I did, because this book is amazing. I loved it. If I had to rate this, I'd probably give this an A minus. Okay. this is an A- book. It is both cerebral and emotional at the same time. It carries a great degree of depth, both, once again, um, philosophical and emotional. It's very well written. John Gardner was a great writer. The writing is very lyrical. It's very poetic, as it should be, considering it is a reinterpretation and a deconstruction, I mean, of a poem. But it's just a really good book. It is a really good book. This is the kind of book that you can reread over and over again, because I do believe that there is a core to this book, that there isn't a real concrete interpretation of this book, but I'm just not myself smart enough to really grasp it. I think I'm trying to. I tried to make this video, this review slash analysis, be, you know, somewhat make it sound like I somewhat got this book, when I'm not sure I did at all. But I loved it nonetheless, and I'm so glad that I bought it, because this is the kind of book you can read over and over again. It is very tragic, it is very sad, and it's very bleak and depressing. And it did bum me out, because I remember when I read this when I was in eighth grade, or when I tried to read this, because I only read like half of it back then. And it's not a long book. It's only, in this edition, my edition, it's only 174 pages. Not a long book. You can read it in a day. But I remembered trying to read it a long time ago, that it really kind of depressed me, and it kind of weirded me out, and it still did it this time. But I was able to appreciate that as just another effect of this book, as part of the impact that it is meant to have by design. And so I think this book really is something of a resounding success overall. Though I think there are a couple issues here and there, but by and large, this book was fantastic. I'm so glad I bought it, and I could definitely recommend this. So, Grendel by John Gardner. Have you read Grendel? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it. I'm willing to bet a lot of, probably most people out there have not read this, because it's kind of an obscure book. You have to kind of really be you really kind of have to be willing to engage with what this book is talking about in order to really enjoy this. If you're not, as I was not when I was in middle school, you're just going to be weirded out and kind of off put and kind of on edge, oddly. But it is a great book. And so, once again, even though I'm pretty sure a lot of people out there probably haven't read this, let me know definitely if you have. And if you haven't read this book, I could definitely recommend it, as long as you know what you're getting yourself into, because it is a really good book if you like that kind of thing. And as always, remember to like and subscribe. And until next time, peace.